now that we're in somewhat, I don't like to call it a trade war, and I think, our country is doing very well, but China's having a very, very tough time. And I think that China makes it much more difficult in terms of our relationship with North Korea.
President Trump blaming China for stalling U.S. nuclear talks with North Korea. The president says Beijing is undermining American diplomacy because of its trade war with the White House. Joining us now, Nile Gardiner, director of the Margaret Thatcher Center at the Heritage Foundation. Nile, the president obviously unhappy with China. Are they the problem here?
Well, I think the key problem with regard to the North Korea issue is the North Korean regime. And the reality is that despite the summit earlier in the summer in Singapore, no real progress has been made in terms of disarming the North Korean regime. We have not seen any significant concessions coming from Pyongyang. The China trade issue here is entirely separate, I think, from the North Korean issue. There's no real direct correlation between the two matters. Of course, the North Koreans, of course, are collaborating with China on many economic fronts. Far more can and should be done by the U.S. administration in terms of sanctioning not only North Korean entities and companies, but also Chinese entities that are doing business with the North Koreans. So that should be the real focus, I think, in terms of Trump's talk about China. But the trade issue, the so-called trade war between Beijing and Washington, that I don't think really factors at all into the broader North Korean matter.
But over at the State Department, the spokeswoman there, Heather Nauert, is saying that China should be living up to its obligations. Listen.
We say this about many other countries around the world, that certain countries, all countries, can do more to adhere to sanctions. We would expect China, just like other countries, to adhere to the UN Security Council resolutions that it too voted for.
You're suggesting that the problem lies not in Beijing, but in Pyongyang.
Well, I think that Beijing certainly is part of the bigger problem with regard to North Korea, but I don't think the U.S.-Chinese trade war issue actually directly relates to the North Korean matter. But what the State Department is saying here, of course, is absolutely right. We do need to see more action being taken by China in terms of reining in the North Korean regime. But at the same time, far more needs to be done by the Trump administration in terms of sanctioning North Korean entities and also Chinese entities as well. There are 12 Chinese banks, for example, that have been listed by the U.S. Congress as targets for U.S. sanctions. Those sanctions have not been implemented yet. And so we need to see a far more aggressive approach being taken by the Trump administration with regard to sanctioning North Korean and Chinese and also Russian entities as well that are doing business with the North Korean regime. But certainly, Beijing is a big part of the overall problem. But the suggestion that the Chinese are acting in a difficult fashion simply because of the trade issue, that I think is certainly not correct at all. China has its own reasons, of course, for being difficult on the North Korean front. But I don't think that is related to the trade battle between Washington and Beijing at this time.
What about this divergence between what